make sure you're in the right room. This is making your responsive site picture perfect. And as you see, this is the 4th time I've given this presentation, so hopefully it's well rehearsed enough. Just to briefly tell you a little bit about me, I work and live in Oak Ridge, Tennessee. I work remotely for a company called DS Federal, primarily a government contractor. I work on a couple of sites. One is a university site and one is a site with the Department of Health and Human Services. I've been using Drupal since 2005, and that sounds like a long time ago, but the job that I have now is my first full-time Drupal job that I started doing that in November. So before that, from 2005 up until last year, I just did Drupal as part of a job of managing websites, and so I used, in a lot of the the main website wasn't even in Drupal, so I just kind of dabbled in it for a while. But anyway, so if you are interested in the information on this presentation, you can download the full presentation, or you can download a PDF from that link, and I'll provide that link again at the end of this session, and if I remember, I'll post it on the Drupal Camp site. So what's the purpose here? What do we want to do with this session, and what do we want to do in general with images? Well, before I get really into the depth of the presentation, I do want to say that this is intended to be a beginner's session, although I realize that many of you are not beginners, but there are pieces of this that maybe even as an experienced developer you have not made use of. So hopefully there's a little bit of information for everybody. Now I will say also that I kind of cover several things in sort of rapid fashion, but as I said, you can download the presentation, and in that are a lot of links to a lot of more detail. So one of the reasons why I'm not giving a lot of detail on this is there's a lot of information about these subjects in the internet. So if you find a piece that you want to know more about, it's easy to get that information. So where we're trying to go really is obvious. We're trying to make our sites look good with images, and yet really what we're talking about is we're trying to make our site look good on any device, and that is where the challenge comes in when it comes to images. Turns out there is a way to do this, and maybe you're doing this now. You add just one line of code to your CSS, max width 100%, that makes your images responsive. Well, mostly. It turns out that this doesn't work on Internet Explorer 6 or 7, and hopefully you're not having to develop for 6 or 7, but sometimes we still have requirements that I have a client that likes to kind of keep 7 as a, so that it doesn't look horrible, at least because they some of their audience is on the Pacific Rim, and so anyway. But if you have Internet Explorer 6 or 7 as a requirement, with 100% will do almost the same thing, and that will make your images responsive, and that's pretty much all you need to know. Thank you very much. Well, I didn't want to cut off the session that quickly, and I suppose you probably figured it wasn't that easy. So first of all, what is the problem with this supposedly easy way of changing your CSS? Well, there's really two problems with it. One is that you're trying to make an image that's big enough for your desktop monitors, squeeze down also into a phone or a tablet. And that is a problem not only in the size of the image, but also in the weight of the image. So you're expecting a mobile user to download a big file that is only really truly visible on a desktop. And that's not very fair to the mobile user. The other problem is you're not taking advantage of the modern displays that are typically called Retina displays. These high density displays will produce images of a factor of 2, maybe even 3 or 4, as we get more, try to condense more and more pixels into the display to make them sharper. So in this example here, you can see a standard density display. I've taken a 2 by 2 pixel chunk out of the image, and then ran it as a factor of 4, which would be for, say, a Retina display. What you're really talking about is 4 times the number of pixels. So that's something that you want to keep in mind, that just resizing the image won't do. It is possible to have a great looking website though if you have the right tools, and so we're going to talk about those tools. We're going to talk about media queries, breakpoints, CSS preprocessors, specifically Sass in this case, Compass, Sprites, icon fonts, Modernizer.js, and vector graphics. So again, like I said, there's lots of things to cover here, and but this is a Drupal presentation, so we should include some Drupal. We're going to talk about Picture Module and Breakpoints Module. Before we go too far, though, let's make sure that we're everybody has a little basic understanding. We're talking about media queries, which are defining a way of making your piece of your CSS work for a specific display. And so a media query is really defining the media, say a screen, and the query would be a expression. It might be width, max width, it might be height. A media query can actually be a number of things, but typically for our purposes, we generally think of widths. Although, as I said, we could choose a media query of a screen resolution, for example. Here's an example of a media query in CSS where the max width then defines a chunk of CSS, and then a different max width defines a different set of CSS. And that's just a quickie example there. That's not yours. CSS would probably not break it out that way, but that gives you the idea. A breakpoint is really just a media query, and it is used in terms of responsive design for when you figure where your screen is going to change in size and how you might want to change the layout or change the colors or change the fonts, change the menus through the use of the breakpoint. So a breakpoint is really just a media query. A multiplier is when we're talking about images and image resolution. And so back in that example where I said a factor of 2, that 2x, that would be a multiplier of 2. Again, a multiplier of 2 means 4 times the number of pixels. When we're talking about a CSS preprocessor, we're talking about less, Sass, stylus. We're talking about a way of being able to add variables, selector inheritance, or other ways that give you some shorthand to put some logic into your CSS to make it more flexible. It seems to me like Sass has become kind of the de facto standard now. It's the one that I use. And one of the reasons why I use it is because we're able to use Compass And Compass is an extension of Sass that provides reusable patterns. And I'll make an example, I'll show you an example of that in a little bit. As I said, we're talking about Picture Module. Picture Module is a way for Drupal to make use of the picture fill polyfill. And that might require a little bit of an explanation. What is a polyfill? A polyfill is just a bit of CSS, a bit of JavaScript that allows the browser to do things that natively it couldn't otherwise do. Picture Module is available in Drupal 7. It's well tested and robust. And it is baked into Drupal 8. So that is one of the reasons why I'm talking about this method of making responsive images as opposed to some of the other methods that you may have either used or have heard about. There are other modules that will do this. In fact, I know there are at least 3 or 4 other modules that will allow you to do responsive images. But the reason why I advocate Picture Module and Breakpoints Module is because if you're using it now in 7, you'll be familiar with it when it comes around in 8. And also because the picture fill polyfill is the primary method of making use of the picture element, which is part of a lot of modern browsers. Now recently there has been some articles about maybe the picture tag is not the best thing to use, but in our case, we are going to use it because that's how Picture Module makes use of responsive images. The other part of this you'll see is source set, and all that is calling an image with a specific media query in it, and then there is a straight image tag as a fallback. The Breakpoints module is pretty much running hand in hand with Picture Module, so it's hard to talk about one without the other. The Breakpoints module is defining the breakpoints of your layout, that where those places where your layout might change depending on usually it's the width, although it could be the resolution or otherwise, but in the case of Breakpoints module, we're only talking about width. And we're not talking about how other parts of your site change with Breakpoints module. We're only talking about images. And specifically, we're talking about images processed through the Image Styles module, which is part of Drupal core and is also part of Drupal 6 or Drupal 7 core. So you're probably already familiar with image styles. So with the combination of Picture Module, Breakpoints Module, and Image Styles, we can do things like not only change the size of an image, but we might also change the cropping of an image for the different sizes of displays and different types of devices. We can also, through the Picture Styles, as well as Picture and Breakpoints modules, then change even the density of the image so that you're able to display appropriately the image for different devices. So here's an example of making use of the Image Styles module in conjunction with how you're going to be plugging it into the Breakpoints module and Picture module. You'll see that we've taken a standard process in a image style of scaling and cropping an image so that when somebody uploads an image through the image field, then it gets processed by cropping and scaling it at 100%. And then what we've done is we've named a specific style for the the multiplier of 2 so that it resizes it to twice the size. Now, what does that do? That, of course, blows it up twice the size of an image. It would therefore increase the number of pixels by 4, a factor of, or it's factor of 2 by 2, so it's 4 times the number of pixels. Then what we're going to do is we're going to resize that image back to this original size. So we're condensing the image, the pixels, to keep the image size looking the same size, but with more pixels. Does that make sense? I mean, you always think of, well, I can't blow up an image in Photoshop because it makes everything fuzzy. But remember, we're rescaling it back down to its original size, and therefore it will look proper. In fact, it will look sharper because it's being displayed in a high-density display. The most effective way I found of using Picture Module and Breakpoints Module is to wait during the development process until you're near the end. The reason I say that is because you are already in the process of trying to work out a lot of other details with responsive layouts. Let's face it, the responsive layouts take 2 or 3 times what a regular layout used to take because you're having to resize and check and all this stuff. So what I do is I work in mobile, and then I widen out the screen, and when things start to look a little bit not right, then I create a new breakpoint where I maybe will change an image size. I might have to change some fonts. I might add a column, keep going wider and wider, and I'm creating breakpoints as I go along. You notice that I didn't say that I'm creating a breakpoint specifically for an iPhone, specifically for an iPad. I'm not trying to create breakpoints based on devices. I'm creating breakpoints based on what looks good on the screen at a specific width. So, and the reason why I'm doing that is because I don't know what device is going to be created 2 years from now. I don't know what the standard sizes are now even, because I don't care. All I care about is what looks good under a specific width. You'll also notice that I'm using kind of funny names here for my breakpoints. Oh, and by the way, what I'm using here is the breakpoint compass extension. And something that I failed to mention is that in my presentation, if you download it, you'll find links to Sass along the way, which gives you an opportunity to test some of these things. So in the case of this example, where I'm using the breakpoint compass extension, that allows me to add just a single variable and provide a size for that variable, and then the compass and breakpoints extension will rewrite everything into the proper formatted media query. Does that make sense? So when it gets chunked out into the CSS that the browser needs, it's rewritten. I don't have to figure out how to rewrite that media query just by using this breakpoint extension. So you'll notice that as I started to mention that I've used funny names, breakpoint hamburger. What that for me is an easier way of remembering what breakpoints I'm using. I'm not concerned about a breakpoint of 320 pixels because I don't know what's going on differently on my display that a breakpoint of 420 or 580 or whatever number, it doesn't matter to me. What matters to me is what's happening on the screen. So at breakpoint hamburger, that's the hamburger icon menu icon. When breakpoint tab happens, that's when I change to the tabs menu style. And breakpoint 2 column just tells me that now my layout is now 2 columns instead of 1. So that's one of the advantages of using Sass is I can just name those variables anything I want that will help me remember what they are. The information that I have collected then in my breakpoints is, and this is another reason why I'm waiting until I have all my breakpoints figured out before I start implementing Breakpoints Module and Picture Module, is that when I have the breakpoints nailed down, I might be changing them, adjusting them here and there a little bit as I go along. But when I finally get them nailed down, that's when I will plug this information into Breakpoints Module. And I can plug it in easily just by way of formatting it properly with the largest breakpoint first and then working down, adding multipliers as well, and then just pasting that into the .info file of my theme. What happens then is that information gets sucked in by the Breakpoints module automatically into the module, just taking it from the theme. You have to clear a cache to make that happen, but once you have done that, it will automatically load it, as you can see here, into the UI of Breakpoints module. Then you have to map the breakpoints to image styles, and that's done through an interface that's something like this, where you are able to select the breakpoints that are in Breakpoints module and then assign or not assign an image style to it. So I may have already created some image styles that are doing things like cropping or changing sizes, and then I will assign an image style to each of those breakpoints if I think that breakpoint needs that different style. If because of the fact that media queries work in a cascade just like CSS does, I may not have to change an image size for every breakpoint. But you can also see why, when you're dealing with not only different breakpoints, but also different multipliers, you may have a lot of configuration, a lot of changes, a lot of settings that you have to make. So this, again, is reason why you probably want to wait until the end so that you don't have to redo this later as you're readjusting your layouts and working on your theme. The one last thing that you have to do to make sure that your images are displayed in this using the picture, you remember the code that I showed you with the picture tag and the source sets and what have you, to make sure that your images are displayed in that way, you have to go back to your content types and select where your file fields or your image fields are in your content types. You have to select picture. Normally it would say image because that comes from your image field. You just have to change it to picture, and then it will automatically display your images in the proper manner. So if you've done it right, any image that came from the image field of your content type is going to be displayed in a size and a cropping and what have you that's appropriate to the display size and the display resolution. And that's all great if you're using the image field, but we don't always use the image field for our web design. We sometimes use things like icons, and in those cases, we still want to handle it responsively, but we don't have the advantage of using Picture Module, Breakpoints Module for that. So what do we do? Well, one way is to use sprites. And maybe you are familiar with sprites because they've been around a while, but I thought that it would be worth covering them because we should be thinking in terms of sprites a little bit differently, responsively, than we would have normally, because we have to consider that resolution difference between a high density display and a regular density display. So a set of sprites has been fine. If you're familiar with how a sprite works, you have one large image that is getting parsed out by CSS. But now with high density images, we may want to, well, we probably will have to do multiple versions of the sprites. And as you can see, that starts to get a little bit unwieldy, especially if you're creating your sprites through Photoshop. Because when you're creating your sprites through Photoshop, you have to figure out on your own and do some calculations of how do I make the CSS work for that. There are a couple of ways that you can speed up the process. But one is an online tool called Sprite Pad. I think there are probably others. That's the one I'm familiar with. And there are also desktop applications like Sprite Master Web. I think it costs $4. And what you do in these cases is you shove all your images into a folder, or you upload them, and then press the button, and it automatically calculates the position of all those images, and then spits out not only a single image, but also the CSS that you're going to use to go with that. And that's all great, except sprites aren't always the best approach. For one thing, they're a pain to maintain if you're in the process of developing. If you want to add another image to your sprite, then that's one more thing that you have to do, and maybe the layout, if you have to take out an image, then that kind of messes up your layout. And also, now that we're talking about the high density images, then we're starting to get into some pretty good size, and so maybe you're not taking all advantage of the images the way the added benefit of the reduced bandwidth that you thought you were getting initially with the sprite. There is another way to make sprites, and that's through Compass and Sass. There is by going to compassstyle.org, you can find a Compass extension that allows you to put all of your images that you want in a sprite into a folder in your theme, and Sass will automatically do the crunching necessary to create one image and create the appropriate CSS with variables so that you can then use it in your Sass. That initial time that happens, it takes a little while for the images to be processed into one image. If you add additional ones, though, to that directory, it automatically does all the recalculation for you. So it's a much more convenient way of creating sprites. Again, though, keep in mind that you're not always going to take advantage of the benefits of sprites now that you're increasing the number of images that you have to include. So maybe you want to find something that's a little bit more efficient. And something that is more efficient for images is icon fonts. Maybe you've already used them, but it's definitely worth something to consider, because icon fonts are scalable, and you can do things with CSS with them, like change color. You can animate them. You don't have any cross-browser compatibility issues, because all modern browsers now can handle different fonts. You remember the old days when you had to pretty much stick to the fonts that your device had? Those days are gone. So we are able to take advantage of icons in fonts in the same way. Now, some icon libraries will tell you, they will give you code. I'm thinking specifically of the Font Awesome library that uses an I tag and then uses some other or there is there's other ways in which you can use an icon where you're assigning a ASCII string to create that icon. And the problem is that for those people who are using screen readers, that screen reader might read that character that was assigned for your icon. So, and it'd be nonsensical to them. So you have to kind of keep in mind how you're coding. There are ways using an ARIA tag or something like that to prevent the screen reader from picking that up. The nice thing about icon fonts is that you can go to a site like one of these three. I think there are several other sites similar to this. I just chose 3 that allow you to pick and choose the icons that you want and create a custom icon font of your own. So you are not having to load a large icon font in which you're only going to use, say, Twitter, Facebook, and YouTube icons or something like that. You can pick and choose the icons you want, and then it will generate the font for you, and then you download it and plug it in as you would any other font that you were installing as part of your library. You can also do it the Drupal way. The Drupal way is to take the Font Awesome library and the Font Awesome module. Now, the downside of that is that it's taking the entire library and in making it part of your installation of Drupal. So you don't have the advantage of having that reduced set of font that you would in the manner I described just now. But the advantage is that you may have some situations where you want to have flexibility in having a wide range of fonts. In the case of the Font Awesome library, there are something like 480 fonts, or 480 icons. So in a situation I had recently where I knew that the content creators were going to want to be able to assign an icon to the section of content that they were creating because that's what the design called for. But we never knew the full range of types of content that they were going to create, so we needed to be able to provide them the flexibility of picking and choosing the icon they wanted. So they can just go to the Font Awesome library and they can see all the fonts that are available, and then all they have to do is paste in the icon string, which is essentially the CSS class, and because it's part of the Font Awesome library and the module, that's all you need to do to display, in this particular case, the icon of choice. Unfortunately, the one thing that font icons cannot do, or icon fonts, is do multiple colors or very complicated logos. And sometimes you just have to, let's face it, a client wants the right colors and all that kind of thing for their logo. So in this case, what I prefer to do is to use the SVG image type rather than PNG or GIFs or JPEGs. Well, why SVG? Well, I think a lot of people have shied away from SVG because it used to be that a lot of browsers could not display an SVG image. That problem has gone away. All the modern browsers are able to display it, and of course, because it's a vector, it's completely scalable, it's resolution independent, and it's actually a very compact file size, so you are able to get away with the fact that it's scalable by also not worrying about the file size. And there are some interesting things that you can do with SVGs. I'm not going to get into that in depth here, but you can, because an SVG can have layers, you can assign classes to each of those layers, and you can therefore, through your CSS, display only one or another or a combination of layers per media query, per breakpoint. You can also do interesting animation things because it's scalable. As I said, modern browsers can now handle it. You'll see that that's a pretty complete list of browsers. The only thing that's missing there is Internet Explorer 8. So when I have a client that expects their site to work properly in Internet Explorer 8, I will have to do a workaround for that, a fallback, and I'll get into an example of that in a minute. But it turns out that making use of a SVG image is pretty simple. Even though you may not have the SVG format, you can just add the image to Illustrator or another vector software, and it will almost always have the ability to save as an SVG. And you don't have to do anything differently. Typically, the default settings that you get when you save as an SVG will work just fine in a browser. One way to add an SVG image to your site is just through the basic image tag that we're all familiar with, source equals logo.svg. You don't have to do anything differently there, although you can also use SVGs as background images. Again, there are some interesting ways in which you can make use of layers and things like that, and displaying it with the simple image tag wouldn't work in that case, but again, I'm not going to get into that. You can also take an SVG output that's just strictly a string of numbers as a text file, and essentially, and just plug that right into your CSS, and that will display the image. So you're not even adding an image to the file directory. You're just plugging the text into your CSS. So as I mentioned, you have maybe the situation where you're trying to design for Internet Explorer 8 and SVG won't work, or some of the other things that we're talking about may not work. What do you do? Well, Modernizer is a great way to deal with that, because Modernizer is a way of, with a little bit of JavaScript, it looks at the browser that's displaying your site, and then it applies a set of CSS classes to the HTML tag. So we're looking here now at the HTML tag at the top of your source code, and you'll see that through Modernizer, we've added a whole bunch of classes, and those classes are reflected in what I'm testing for with the Modernizer JavaScript. And I don't have to test for all these things. If I don't care about Flexbox or the canvas capabilities of the browser, then I don't have to worry about that. I can go to modernizer.com and select the things that I want to test for, and one of those maybe is SVG. So you'll see I'm testing for SVG. If the browser can display an SVG, then it adds the SVG tag in the HTML class, and then I can just use that as part of my CSS. Here is in the case of Sass, where I'm not excluding for SVG by way of the CSS, but I'm able to do so by way of using the Breakpoint compass extension, which we talked about before, but in this case I'm using the screen resolution, because I'm going to assume that the screen If the screen is unable to display a high-density display, then perhaps it can't display SVG images. I mean, that's one way of doing it. I wouldn't necessarily take that approach, but I may want to use this for some other purposes of how I'm going to write around certain uses of high-density images or avoid them. How do you know when you have a high-density display? One way to find out is to take that device and go to this site, and it will tell you right there what you're looking at. And it will also, if you were to scroll down the page, you will be able to see a list of similar devices that have that capability. Another way is to go to icanuse.com. They've redesigned the site since I made this screen grab, so it may not look exactly this way. But if you want to say what browsers are able to see SVG images, all you have to do is, can I use SVG? And it will give you the current browsers that can handle SVG image, and you'll see that that list that I showed you earlier. But if you're trying to do some other things, icanuse.com is a handy tool for those. All right, so we have talked about a lot of things, but how do we know that we've achieved what we're trying to do? We know that we've achieved it when the images of our site change depending on how the layout changes. So that's the images are appropriate to the context in which they're displayed. So that may be in terms of the column width. It may be things like screen size. The other thing that we want to check for is to make sure that we're optimized for high density screens. So when a high density screen display, high density screen is looking at your site, you want to make sure that your images are just as sharp as they can be. And we're taking advantage of different MIME types for the circumstances that are appropriate. We can't use an SVG for everything. We can't use it for your basic pictures. We can't, probably are not going to want to try to upload through the image file SVG images, so we will use a JPEG probably for that, but we're using different MIME types as appropriate for the circumstances. So that is the end of the presentation. I will be happy, I think we still have a little bit of time to take some questions, but before we do, I want to remind you that there are lots and lots of references at the end of this presentation. So if you're interested in any of this stuff, these are just examples. These are pages that I've referred to or I thought were interesting. You can get a copy of the presentation there, and I will add a link at the camp website. Any questions? No questions? Yes?
A few slides back, you had a link to a blog post that would show you what your screen density was.
Yes. You want to see that again?
I'm sorry to say that I typed wrong or something. There you go. And is that, does he have just like a little widget there or something that's showing you your...
When you go to that page, it automatically gives you that information.
One question I was also wondering about is when you're talking about full accessibility and icons and whether, you know, how screen readers deal with that.
Yes.
Considering that we have a tendency, good or bad, to use background images,
Yes.
you know, for bullets and those kinds of icons.
Right.
Is there maybe an advantage to using an icon because you could put maybe a title attribute or something that maybe the screen reader would pick up? You know,
Well,
that,
I mean,
that might indicate what its function is?
You talk about background images, and there is, you know, if you're familiar with Section 508, there is definitely a concern about contrast. And a background image could possibly impede that. Although one of the other parts of Section 508 is to have multiple ways of identifying the content, either through not just the text, but maybe a change of color to identify that it's a link, as long as it's a good change of color, or maybe an extra arrow that does some pointing or something. So it's possible to make use of background images to do those things as well, as long as you're...
Right, okay. But could the use of, you know, an I tag, if you add a title to it, or, you know, is that going to help a screen reader if you put a title or,
well, again,
some kind of attribute?
The main thing
a way
is
to add an attribute that screen reader is going to understand.
right. A title tag may be helpful, yes, but in fact, Section 508 says you're supposed to use a title tag. But the issue here with icons in icon fonts is that there's a character that is generally nonsensical, and the screen reader is going to say that as if it were just text. It's going to read that unless you have some way encapsulated that so that it is not being read by the screen reader.
Okay. Well, Bootstrap uses you know, before and afters in its iconography, and it's
yeah, except that's in CSS, so it's not going to read the before or after.
But I'm trying to think of a way, because I hadn't thought about it before, so you said that, and I'm trying to think of a way, maybe, It's not going to read the before, screen readers don't read the before and after.
No, because that's part of CSS.
Okay. And it's only going to read what is rendered in the page source. Interesting thought.
Yeah, so, you know, one good way is just to read the page source, but read it through something like Firebug so that you're reading it as the browser would read it. Anybody else? Well, thank you very much. I also have contact information if anybody has any questions they want to hit me up with later. Thanks.